Hey everybody, this is Mr. Williams again, and right now we're going to be taking a look at key question number 2 of chapter 1. Let's take a quick look at the question. Policies are rules or actions conducted by government, but how are they shaped and carried out? That's what we're going to be taking a look at in this specific chapter video. Now, first, I want us to get a better feel of this specific wheel here of linkage institutions. Now, we're going to be taking a real close look at a variety of different linkage institutions in Unit 4 of AP Government. But for now, I want to give us a very brief rundown. Ultimately, the idea of linkage institutions begins with the idea of people, right? So, for instance, there are a number of folks right now that are very concerned about police brutality, right? And they're protesting in the streets, they're contacting their Congress members, they're pressuring those Congress members to enact some kind of change. They're pressuring local governments to ultimately do the same, and sometimes the president. Well, let's kind of trace that example through this wheel here. So we discussed the problems here: police brutality or police accountability. Those folks, through those interest groups or through their political parties, are ultimately pressuring those in the political sphere or elected officials, be it their city council members or their state legislators or their US Congress members, to get that on their priority list. In other words, these are bills and actions that need to be debated right away. This isn't something that needs to be looked at 12 years now. It needs to be discussed right now. If they're successful, and ultimately, that particular bit of legislation or proposed idea goes through the legislature successfully and gets signed by the executive, be it the governor or the US president, and it becomes law and the courts end up upholding it, then it ultimately enters the policy implementation stage. And just to be clear on what the term implementation means, it just means being carried out. So, for instance, that police accountability bill might take a variety of different forms. Let's say they ban chokeholds, right? This is a particular proposal that's been made right now. It was in the Sacramento Bee just this morning. If that bill ends up going through, now how well that policy is implemented might vary radically within that state. If such a bill was passed within this state and the governor signed on after it passes through the legislature, some police departments might implement this to the hilt and not once use the sort of chokeholds that are banned within this specific bit of legislation, but other police departments might balk on that a little bit, and how much the governor and the Department of Justice within that state choose to kind of crack down on that specific thing is really what this policy piece is all about. Because simply because a law is passed doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's on board and going to be implementing it to the hilt. A perfect example of that is when the governor signed an executive order about not an executive order, but ultimately said that the entire state should be wearing masks. Well, Sheriff Scott Jones is basically saying, I'm not going to issue any infractions, issue any things there about that. So again, different people within the state, different bodies of enforcement might have different ideas about how to carry out those sorts of actions. And that has real impacts on people. Some people might cheer on Sheriff Scott Jones for not following that specific mandate regarding the masks, and some ultimately might have a real problem with it and say that he's contributing to that problem. So this really speaks to how linkage institutions work. But again, we'll speak more on that a little bit later there. Now let's look at this policy piece through this specific lens. So first, you ultimately have a statute. So whether or not that's the chokehold, barring chokeholds of any kind, or an act like the Affordable Care Act, or a variety of different things. It starts with a law, right? Once that is ultimately passed, then you have like a rule or a governmental action that's in place regarding that law. And then ultimately policy is carried out. And that policy is implemented in a variety of different ways. And it's dependent upon the philosophy and the ideas of how those people see that law being carried out. Just like I brought up with Sheriff Scott Jones, he might not be willing to kind of issue tickets or infractions for people who violate mask mandates or who ultimately hang out in large groups, but maybe Sheriff Hahn, through the Sacramento Police Department, is willing to do that. So now let's take a look at a specific governmental statute, and that is the Clean Air Act. So that was passed. A few different versions of it were passed, but I believe the first was passed in 1970. Congress passed this in large part because they were concerned about carbon emissions and a variety of other problems of what was coming out into the air. So they passed these pretty strict restrictions that pose quite a few limits on factories and whatnot, right? Well, as they created that, they then had to have some sort of agency or some sort of governmental organization that's going to carry that out. The president isn't going to be out there ensuring that Exxon isn't pouring out too many carbon emissions into the environment, and neither is the president. So ultimately, they created a governmental agency called the Environmental Protection Agency, and it is their job ultimately to carry out that specific statute, right, or that policy. But as you can imagine, if the president gets to determine who is going to be the head of these different agencies, that will very much determine how much those are enforced. A perfect example of that is Obama's head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who he appoints, might have a different view of how stringently or how strictly to enforce the Clean Air Act than, say, a Trump appointee. And those differences matter. Another thing that really matters here, folks, and what I want you to take a look at here is voter turnout. Now, many of you are probably already aware of the fact that voter turnout among younger populations, this blue line here, is quite a bit lower. You can see that on what are called midterm elections, it's at roughly 20% all the way through. And you can see it spikes on the presidential elections, as it does for all of those folks. But whether or not you're talking about a midterm election or a presidential election, younger populations are far lower than any other age group, particularly those 60 and above. Now, I want you to think here real quick. Who do you think is going to have an easier time getting their top priorities on the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate's policy agenda? In other words, what kind of laws they want passed. For instance, do you think it's going to be more, say, like gun control legislation, or let's say any number of different priorities of younger people here? It might be something like universal health care. Or do you think older folks might be able to get their agenda heard a little bit more, like something related to Social Security or Medicare? I think it becomes pretty clear that if I'm a Congress member and I want to make sure that I get elected, am I going to be paying attention to the people who vote in such low numbers? Or am I going to set a top priority for the policies put forward by those who vote me in most? Guys, I think that the answer to that question is pretty obvious there. So it is something that you want to think about when folks say voting doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. You vote, you have a say in what that policy agenda ends up being. And if you're voting in a large enough coalition, you have more say in that. Now, let's look at policy impacts. A moment ago, we mentioned the Affordable Care Act. And what we ultimately see here is that the number of uninsured is likely to grow. And the way to think about that is that the Trump administration has different views on the Affordable Care Act. For instance, one of the big problems that they have with Obamacare is the individual mandate. They are basically saying you have to get health insurance. And there are a number of Republicans who take issue with that. They have a big priority of freedom over mandates there, particularly of how to handle their bodies. They feel like this is my body. I get to say within that. So the Republicans in the Senate and the Republicans in the White House have ultimately done what they can to try to eliminate portions of Obamacare there. And the individual mandate was a part of that, which is why that does have an impact, though, folks, that there is a rise in the number of insured. On one hand, that gives people more freedom to get the sort of insurance that they want and when they want. On the other hand, that could pose potential health problems, particularly when relating to the question that I have here about what kind of impact is this lower number of insured citizens going to have with what we're facing right now with COVID. So this is something you really want to be thinking about. In addition to that, policy impacts have a part to play within representative bodies as well. So let's look at this. On one hand, we believe in majority rule. For instance, we have the House of Representatives that's based on population. the larger your state, the more representation you have within the House of Representatives, which is why it's set up that way. But we also have the Senate, which is based more on the idea of minority rights, and that every state gets 2 senators, which disproportionately benefits smaller states. California's amount of representation relative to smaller states like Wyoming is huge, and we'll look at that more later on, but those are some aspects to that. In addition to that, again, views of that minority rights versus majority rule vary quite a bit, and how that's interpreted could change. Under the Obama years, the democratically controlled Senate decided to set up the nuclear option. And as such, they ultimately limited the amount of time debate could occur, or the ability to kind of stop legislation that the Republicans didn't want. The Democrats basically said, we're going to set up the nuclear option. You all Republicans can be quiet. We're going to push this bill through. Well, you can bet what happened when the Democrats lost the Senate and the Republicans came through. In other words, policy impacts have a part there too. You have a rule in place in the Constitution regarding minority rights versus majority rule, but how that's interpreted and how that's carried out can change upon different administrations, because there are some rules that are set in stone within the Constitution. However, there are some that are kind of open interpretation. Shouldn't have said set in stone. The Constitution can be amended, but you get my point. Statutes are a lot easier to change. Constitutional law is not. And that, folks, is ultimately where I'm going to end the second view. So the big thing that I want you to be thinking about with policy is what exactly is it? How exactly does it start? What's that process? Think of that wheel that we were looking at a moment ago. And even after it's passed, how does who is in power at any given time impact the way that that particular policy is carried out? So thanks for the time, everybody. I hope you found this informative. Bye-bye.